Ever imagine running into someone who looks exactly like you? Like down to the last freckle.
Yeah.
Even that way you tilt your head when you're thinking hard. Sounds like something straight out of science fiction, huh?
Definitely has that sci-fi feel.
Well, today on Dan's Plane, we're diving deep into the real science and the wild story behind human cloning. I'm Edward.
And I'm Lily.
So, human cloning. What are we really talking about here, Lily? I mean, at its core.
We're essentially talking about creating a genetically identical copy of a person, a duplicate, if you will.
A duplicate. Wow. And in this deep dive, we're going to unpack it all. The history, which honestly goes way further back than most people think.
Oh, absolutely.
The science behind it, what's working, what's still, being figured out. We'll take a trip through how science fiction's imagined cloning, which is always a wild ride.
Always.
We'll look at where things stand today in labs all over the world, what the future might hold, and of course, all those really tricky ethical questions this whole thing brings up.
It's a big one.
It's a huge one. So what's our mission for this deep dive then?
Well, I think our mission is to demystify human cloning. Help people really understand this topic. Specifically, we want to tackle that big question. Do human clones actually exist out there right now?
Right now. And what are all the issues wrapped up in that?
Exactly. All the complexities.
All the complexities. It's a concept that grabs you, doesn't it? Touches on biology, how we see ourselves, even what society might look like down the road.
It really does. It makes you think about the big picture, that's for sure.
So to really understand all this, we got to lay some groundwork. Go back to where the idea of, actually making identical copies first popped up in science.
Right. Back to the roots.
And, it's way before Dolly the sheep, that's for sure. I think a lot of people, their minds jump straight to Dolly.
Yeah, Dolly's the big one in the public imagination, but the science goes back further, way further.
So take us back.
Okay, so think about this. 1885. A scientist named Hans Driesch is working with sea urchins, tiny little creatures, and he discovers something incredible. If you separate the cells of a really, really early sea urchin embryo, the very first stages, each of those cells can actually grow into a whole, complete sea urchin.
Wow. So one becomes many, identical copies.
Exactly. And that was a huge revelation. It showed that a single cell at that early stage has this mind-blowing potential to create an entire organism.
That's pretty wild. So sea urchins, we've got the potential there, but then what? We need to make a jump, right, to something a bit more, I don't know, complex.
Right. And that jump takes us to frogs. 1952, scientists Robert Briggs and Thomas King, they successfully cloned frogs. Now, they used a technique called nuclear transfer.
Nuclear transfer. Okay, break that down for us.
Imagine this. You take the nucleus, think of it as the control center from a cell of a tadpole embryo, and you very carefully put it into a frog egg that's had its own nucleus taken out.
Like a swamp.
Exactly, a nucleus swap. And that reconstructed egg, it starts to develop as if it had been fertilized naturally. It grows into a tadpole.
Amazing. So it's not just like splitting a really early embryo. They're taking a nucleus and making a whole new organism.
Right, and that was a major step. It showed that the nucleus from a cell that's already started to develop, not just a freshly fertilized egg, could still guide the creation of a whole new life.
So we've got sea urchins, frogs. We're moving up the complexity ladder here.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of our listeners, when they think cloning, one word pops into their mind: Dolly.
Dolly the sheep, the rock star of cloning.
Exactly.
Dolly was a game changer. 1996, at the Roslin Institute in Scotland, she was the first mammal ever cloned from an adult cell.
An adult cell. That's key, right? Not an embryo.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They took a cell from a sheep's mammary gland, a fully grown adult sheep, and used that to create Dolly.
What was the technique?
It's called somatic cell nuclear transfer, or SCNT. It's basically the same principle as that frog experiment we talked about. You take the nucleus from an adult cell, put it into an egg cell that's had its own nucleus removed, stimulate it to divide, and boom, potentially a new organism.
Dolly. Front page news everywhere. It was huge.
It really captured the world's imagination.
But Dolly's story, it wasn't all, happy farmyard stuff after that, was it?
Sadly, no. Dolly developed some health problems quite early on, arthritis and other issues. She ended up having to be euthanized at 6 years old.
6 years old.
Yeah, which is about half the normal lifespan for a sheep like her. And that was a big red flag. It showed that cloning from adult cells, even though we could do it, came with some serious biological challenges, potential health consequences too.
So when we talk about human cloning, are we essentially talking about that same SCNG process that brought Dolly into the world?
That's the method that would be considered, yes. You take a nucleus from any cell in a human's body except for sperm or egg cells and put it into a human egg cell that's had its own nucleus removed. The goal would be to get that egg to start developing, just like a naturally fertilized egg. And theoretically, if everything went perfectly, you could implant that developing embryo into a woman's uterus.
Okay, but you used the word theoretically there. And we talked about Dolly's health problems. What are the big roadblocks that are keeping this from being, a safe, reliable reality for humans right now?
Two main issues. One, success rates are super low. Remember, it took 277 attempts to get Dolly.
Wow.
277.
Yeah, and that low efficiency is pretty consistent across other species that have been cloned.
So a lot of tries for one success. What's the other big issue?
The high rate of health problems in cloned animals, and this comes down to what we call epigenetic errors. Think of it like this DNA is the hardware, the instructions, but epigenetics is like the software telling those instructions when and how to work.
Okay, I'm following.
Now, an adult cell's DNA, it already has a whole lifetime's worth of epigenetic instructions guiding how that cell functions. But when we clone, we're trying to wipe those instructions and rewrite them for a brand new process embryonic development. And that reprogramming, it often goes wrong. It's incomplete, messed up, and that leads to all sorts of developmental issues. Defective organs, weak immune systems, premature aging.
So even if someone did manage to make a cloned human embryo, the odds of it becoming a healthy baby are really, really slim, given all these challenges.
That's the reality right now. The scientific community is pretty much unanimous on this. Attempting human reproductive cloning is incredibly risky. Ethically, it's a huge problem, and the science just isn't there yet.
And that's a stark contrast to how we often see cloning portrayed, right? Our imaginations, I think, have been largely shaped by science fiction.
Oh, absolutely. Science fiction has had a massive influence on how we think about cloning.
So let's get into that. How has science fiction, those stories, shaped our perceptions of this tech?
It's painted some pretty vivid pictures, often quite dark, cautionary tales about what cloning could mean for us.
Give us some examples. What are some of the big sci-fi stories that have really explored cloning?
Well, one of the classics is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley from 1932, so it's been around a while.
Brave New World, yeah, I remember reading that in school.
It imagines a future where humans are cloned, but they're also conditioned into strict social classes. It raises those deep questions about what makes us individuals, the pressures of conformity, what it even means to be human when your existence is manufactured.
It's a chilling vision, that's for sure. What else comes to mind?
Blade Runner, both the book and the movie. It's got replicants, basically, bioengineered beings that are clones used for forced labor.
Right, exploited clones.
Exactly. It makes you think about autonomy, what rights those artificial humans might have. The ethics of using them like that really challenges how we define life and consciousness.
Heavy stuff. Any more recent examples?
The Island, a film from 2005, takes it to a whole other level. It's about humans being cloned specifically to be organ donors. Spare parts, essentially.
Wow. That's dark.
It really taps into that fear of the commodification of human life. Clones as just, a collection of organs to be harvested.
And we can't forget Orphan Black, the TV series.
Oh, great one. It follows this whole network of human clones, all dealing with questions of identity, their origins, and the mysterious corporation that made them. It really digs into the personal and societal impacts on individuals who are genetically identical but living very different lives.
It's interesting, though, how a lot of these fictional portrayals, they lean toward the darker side of cloning. That potential for exploitation, losing individuality, those ethical nightmares.
It's true. Science fiction often serves as a warning. It explores the potential downsides of powerful technologies, and it often jumps way ahead of the actual science, makes cloning seem more advanced, more problematic than it really is right now. And that shapes public debate, for sure. It fuels those anxieties about cloning.
You like Jurassic Park, right? Even though it's about dinosaurs, not humans, I bet that movie really shaped how people think about cloning in general. Made it seem more possible, maybe scarier, too.
Jurassic Park definitely had a huge cultural impact, bringing back extinct creatures, even though the science in the movie is, well, let's say it's Hollywood science. It got people thinking about what cloning could do, even if it's not exactly realistic.
So we've got the reality of the science still facing those huge hurdles, and we've got science fiction feeding our imaginations, often in a pretty dramatic way. So where are we actually at today, Lily? Do we have any confirmed human clones walking around?
The short answer is no. The scientific consensus is very clear on this. There are no verified human clones that we know of. There have been claims over the years, but none of them have ever been backed up with solid scientific evidence.
You're talking about claims like that group, Clonaid, right?
Yeah.
They made a lot of noise a while back.
Yeah, Clonaid.
Yeah.
They were connected to the Reelian movement, which is, well, a whole other topic.
Definitely a whole other topic.
Back in 2002, they made a very public announcement claiming they'd created the first cloned baby named Eve, but they never offered any real proof. The scientific community pretty much dismissed it as a hoax because there was no evidence, and Clonaid's background raised some eyebrows.
Right, right. And then there was that South Korean scientist, Hwang Woo-suk. He made some pretty big claims too, didn't he?
He did. In the mid-2000s, he said his team had cloned human embryos. It was a huge deal at the time. But later, investigations found that he'd faked his data. The whole thing was a scandal, and his work was retracted.
So we've got these big claims, no real evidence. But it's not just the science that's holding things back, right? There are legal and ethical barriers too.
Absolutely. A lot of countries have outlawed reproductive cloning, making a whole human clone. Over 40 nations, including the UK and Japan, have banned it.
Wow, so it's pretty widely opposed.
Yeah, it reflects those ethical concerns that this whole topic brings up. The U.S. doesn't have a federal ban, but there are state laws, and international agreements push for restrictions, too.
And it's important to be clear about the difference between reproductive cloning, making a whole person, and therapeutic cloning, right?
Absolutely. Therapeutic cloning is about creating clone cells for research, mainly, like to study diseases or develop treatments. The goal isn't to make a whole human being.
So, like, scientists might clone embryos to get embryonic stem cells.
Exactly. Those stem cells can turn into pretty much any cell in the body. So they're incredibly valuable for research, potentially for creating new therapies too. And therapeutic cloning is happening, it's ongoing, but it doesn't lead to babies being born, which again just reinforces the fact that we don't have human clones walking around right now.
Okay, so no confirmed clones today. But what about the future? What are scientists looking at down the line in this whole cloning world?
Well, the future of human cloning is tied to some major advancements that are still in the works. Like, if we could refine that SCNT technique, make it way more efficient and safer, that would be huge.
Right, those were the big hurdles we talked about before.
Exactly. And then there's gene editing, CRISPR. You've probably heard of it.
CRISPR, yeah. It's like the hot topic in genetics these days.
It has the potential to fix those epigenetic errors we talked about. That could make cloning more viable, healthier. And then there's the idea of artificial wombs. Still pretty sci-fi, but it could get around some biological and ethical issues with traditional pregnancy.
Okay, so those are the scientific advances. What about applications? Like, what could this actually lead to in the real world?
One big one is creating organs for transplants. Imagine growing a heart, a liver, a kidney. That's a perfect genetic match for a patient. No more rejection issues.
That would be incredible.
Right. It could be revolutionary for medicine. And it's been suggested as a way to help infertile couples have children who are genetically related to them. And as we said, therapeutic cloning with stem cells, that has huge potential for disease research and new treatments.
But even with all that amazing potential, we come back to those big, thorny ethical questions, don't we?
We absolutely do. Even if the science gets there, the ethics of human cloning are incredibly complex. There are concerns about the psychological impact on a clone. Would they have an identity crisis? Feel like a copy, not an individual?
It's a deep question.
It really is. And then there's the risk of exploitation, like we saw in some of those sci-fi stories. The idea of harvesting organs or cloning to fulfill someone's narcissistic desires. And of course, there are moral and religious objections. The idea that cloning is unnatural, that it violates the sanctity of human life.
And it seems like those legal restrictions and how the public feels about it are probably going to keep reproductive cloning in check for a while, right?
Yeah, that's the general thinking. Polls show most people are against human reproductive cloning. So with public opinion, laws, and the ongoing ethical debates, it doesn't seem likely to happen anytime soon. Therapeutic cloning might move forward, but even that's going to be under strict oversight and regulations.
Which brings us to the heart of the debate, really. The controversies surrounding human cloning. It's not just a science issue, is it?
It's so much bigger than that. It's got ethical, legal, social, and scientific dimensions. Ethically, there are those big questions about identity, individuality, the autonomy of a clone. Would they be discriminated against? What rights would they have? How would society view them? It gets complicated.
And the legal side is a mess too, right? With different countries having different laws.
Yeah, a real patchwork. It shows how hard it is to regulate something like this. The WHO, the World Health Organization, and other international groups have called for a ban on reproductive cloning. They're worried about the safety and the wider impact on society.
So we've got the ethics, the laws. What about the social side of things? The stuff we might not think about right away.
Cloning could change how we think about family, about relationships. It might even affect the human gene pool in the long run, though that's way down the line. And there are economic issues. What if cloning becomes super expensive, only available to the wealthy? It could make inequality worse.
And of course, we can't forget the science itself. We're still not there yet.
Right. Cloning is still inefficient, and we see those health risks in animals. The long-term safety for a human clone is a huge concern. We've got a lot to learn about how genes and epigenetics work together in development.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive, Lily. From those early experiments to science fiction to the ethics, the realities. It really shows how human cloning, at least for now, is more of a topic for discussion and debate than something that's happening in the real world.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's an evolving topic as our science changes and our values change. There are no easy answers here. The debate will continue, that's for sure.
So as we wrap up, what are the key takeaways from all this? The things our listeners should really remember about human cloning.
First, no verified human clones exist. Despite what you might hear, there's no proof. Second, the science is tricky. Huge hurdles, ethical problems. It's just not practical right now, and most people are against it. And lastly, it's controversial for good reason. It gets at the core of what it means to be human, our identity, our morality. It's more prevalent in fiction than reality, that's for sure.
Lily, this has been a fascinating deep dive. It really shows how science, ethics, and our own imaginations all get tangled up in a topic like this.
It's a great example of how we have to think about not just what we can do with science, but what we should do. What's right, what's responsible.
And on that note, here's something for our listeners to ponder. With all the advances in genetics, not just cloning, but gene editing and other things, what does being an individual even mean anymore? And what is the sanctity of human life when we can change our biology so much? Something to think about.
It's a big question for our times, for sure.
For more deep dives like this, articles, info on our partner products, and a whole lot more, visit us at www.dansplain.xyz. And as always, thanks for joining Edward and Lily on another Dansbang Deep Dive.